Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event. I'm Eric Lorberer. I'm the director of Rain Taxi. If you don't know about us yet, we are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature. Our work revolves around a quarterly magazine of critical writing. This is our spring issue I'm holding up. And if you would like to hold it too, we would love to mail you a copy. Check out our website anytime after tonight's event and see if you might be interested. You might want to become a Rain Taxi member as well and get all of our forthcoming issues sent to your mailbox. Another way we advocate for great literature is through events like this. Tonight's event, like most of ours, is free to attend, but if you're able to pitch in a little something, please use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Rain Taxi is privileged to receive funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, but our most vital supporters are individuals like you. There are lots of other ways you can participate on screen tonight. There's the chat, of course. Keep those comments coming. If you have a question for our guest tonight, you can put that in the Ask a Question box, and we'll try to get to some of those at the end. And of course, you can buy the book. And this is a great book to buy. If you hit the button there, you will be taken right to the ordering page for Save It for Later at our partner bookseller, Majors & Quinn, here in Minneapolis. And if there are other books on your wish list, don't stop there. Any book you buy tonight from Majors & Quinn helps support our series. I'll say a little bit more about great bookstores at the end of tonight's show, but now it's my great pleasure to welcome Nate Powell. Nate is one of the most distinguished cartoonists in our country. He has won the National Book Award, as well as a slew of other awards for his work. And his latest book, as I've just mentioned, is Save It for Later. It's subtitled Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest. Nate, thanks so much for being here.
Hey there, glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to get right into this. I just think it's such there's so many ways to talk about it. And I think the first thing I want to say is I love that it's a book of essays. Which is not necessarily the most common genre for comics to explore. What led you to compile a book of graphic essays?
Well, I'd say that I do both fiction and nonfiction work, and particularly over the course of, I was doing kind of autobiographical comic essays on and off throughout the mid 2000s. But really working on the March trilogy helped me understand and improve upon my ability to be concrete, to be a little more concise, and to kind of deliver thoughts in a way that didn't have to be wrapped up in some other fantastic apparatus. That being said, I'm not really a person who's very interested in making autobiographical comics anymore. However, Save It for Later kind of emerged out of a sense of urgency, but also by embracing the fact that comics work as therapy for me and work to be able to organize and crystallize my own thoughts and feelings, even before I get to the point where I feel like it's something that I want to share with the world. So for a lot of this, these are 7 interwoven essays. Some of them are more memoir-based. Some are a little more objective, with a little bit of digging and research that goes behind it. But each one is able to kind of either capture a moment or serve as a bridge between 2 other chapters. I don't know. I think a lot of it also has to do with being somebody who came of age in the 90s in underground punk, and not only being very deeply entrenched in making my own fanzines as personal expression, but also really embracing the notion of the personal is the political. And this was just a well-timed moment to sort of rediscover the value of making shorter essay work like this that builds up to something much larger than the sum of its parts.
What a great overview and a great sort of laying out of some of that feeling that there are so many directions we could talk about here. let's stick with one of the themes you mentioned, the personal and the political, and how those connect. That really struck me reading the book, that that it works so well because both of those things are present, maybe to different degrees in different essays, but um, yeah, I think it's important that we're not being preached at, you know,
Oh,
and
me
it
too.
seemed like that so, but because you mentioned that you didn't, that you're maybe not uh, a full-on aficionado of the autobiographical mode, what went through your mind as you were bringing in a lot of really personal stuff to this, you know?
Well, I mean, in general, by the end of 2017, uh, I started, organizing a few thoughts, really not even in my sketchbook at that point, like in notes in my phone, um, moments, observations. But a lot of this had to do with living under this authoritarian regime for a year at that point, and seeing from the starting gate a push for pretty drastic change in policy, in social structure, in a real upheaval of our basic assumptions of our shared society. And I think getting into assumptions is something that becomes increasingly significant later in the book. But there was so much happening at once, like 100 fires happening at once. Things are moving so quickly that I noticed, definitely within myself and with a lot of people who I trust and know, that there is a little bit of an assumption that the personal subjective experience of living in and through and pushing against this authoritarian power grab has personal ramifications. How it impacts, whether it's things that seem mundane, how it impacts, eating, sleeping, getting work done, but parenting, dealing with one's extended family, dealing with neighbors, how it impacts almost any interaction in life. These are really significant. This shapes the way we interact with the world. But, I'd catch myself being like, there's just not enough bandwidth. Like, who needs to hear me run my mouth about anything like this? Like, we've got enough to do. Like, so I think most of us, and I mean that across the political spectrum. I mean, even going into the center right, like a lot of like rational, sane, moderate conservatives who were also scared, anxious, and normalization may have happened more quickly for those folks. But this was a state that I think by a year into the previous administration was not being publicly addressed. There wasn't space carved out for it. So as soon as I realized I had a few moments that were already slipping away from memory or from my ability to encapsulate what was powerful or relevant, I knew that I needed to at least write them down in my sketchbook. And then one thing quickly led to another, and I realized that I had the chance to do something that was raw and personal for me and had emotional immediacy. But specifically, I thought it was something worth making and sharing because it really didn't specifically have to do with me. It had to do with these very broadly shared experiences that I feel like, weren't being aired because of so much else going on.
Yeah, that's really great.
Really great.
It makes me realize that journalism is another sort of aspect here, where you're kind of chronicling what is happening in reality.
Literally journalism,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had the pleasure of speaking with Joe Sacco about that, and just the importance of I'm remembering how important it is for him to put himself in the comic, right? To be a figure, and I feel that is true in your work as well here. Now, another thing that what you just said brings to mind is the contrast in a way between fiction and nonfiction. And I'm a big admirer of your fiction comics as well, such as Swallow Me Whole. I think you've got, you know, an inventive storytelling technique that lends itself so well to this kind of the fictive environment. And I think one thing when Save It for Later came out or was announced, I thought, oh, this is interesting. I might have thought, well, maybe you know, in a way, taking a break from the March trilogy and create something fictive. But at the same time, I thought this builds on March in such an interesting way, and it feels like a book that maybe is influenced by your experience of helping to tell John Lewis's story. Can you talk about that in any way? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Save It for Later was without a doubt influenced by my work on March and by my experience making March and my experience with Congressman Lewis. A lot of that, I think, is less about the work on March than Congressman Lewis's influence on my older daughter more than my younger daughter, but my kids' development, their awareness of the world, March then post-creation becoming a reading material. And I sort of got to experience it in a completely new way, strictly as a reader and as a guide for my kids starting at age 4, which was, from a readership perspective, was a revolutionary experience for me as a dad and as a cartoonist. It sort of required a lot of exercises in mindfulness of where my kid was in terms of their own rapidly expanding worldview, what their concepts of fairness and injustice were, what their experiences with bullies and with power were, and being able to kind of guide my kids in a way that allowed each reading of March to get more complex and more in-depth each time around. In terms of the balance between fiction and nonfiction, I'm very much like, my fiction is very kind of like dreamy, ghost and longing filled kind of Southern Gothic with a tinge of like punk space opera or something, but with an occasional demon. But you know, my fiction is very much truth telling in the same way that my nonfiction work is. It's basically finding a way to say something or communicate something that is true, and then finding a way to wrap it up in the artifice of storytelling to make something that is meaningful and entertaining and satisfying in a different way. So they're both satisfying for getting that sense of getting to the truth of something and being real about things. And a lot of it is just kind of the swing of the pendulum back and forth between being more concrete and more objective, and then kind of letting myself play for a year or two doing an actual graphic novel. Yeah. Wow. Let me ask you one more question before we look at a few images from the book. Another sort of contrast, I think, that comes to mind, similar to fiction or nonfiction, is the fact that March was such a highly collaborative project, not only with Congressman Lewis, but with your other writing and art collaborators. And this is an intensely solo project. And so are there, did differences emerge in those practices that you felt affected the end result, either way? Yeah. Certainly. In terms of the March trilogy first, amongst Andrew Iden and the late great Congressman Lewis and our editor Lee and I, there's a marked difference, I guess, between March Book 1 and then Books 2 and 3. Book 1 was really the process by which we learned how to work together and how to write or draw for each other, for each other's skill sets, and keeping an eye out for each other's weaknesses, etc. Books 2 and 3, I think 2 really being the peak of our powers, where we had the most bandwidth to in March, we had the most bandwidth in book 2 to kind of push the personal subjective experiences of Congressman Lewis as a young person, as memoir, balanced with his first person experience as a witness to and of history. And then as the content intensifies and gets denser and denser, I think we did a bang up job with book 3, but it was also like we ran out of a lot of bandwidth because there was so much history to get in there. But yeah, like over the process of doing March, I think the need to sort of evolve with my ability to read between the lines of someone else's script, to learn which questions to ask and circle back around to with Congressman Lewis in particular, how to fish for sensory memories from him, which may not be contained in any primary sources or documentation. I was able to take a lot of that and bring it to my weirdo fiction, which allowed me to make like Come Again, which came out 3 years ago. I was writing and penciling that during March, and it's the furthest out there of all my fiction work, and yet it's the most concrete and accessible from a narrative standpoint, thanks to the years kind of in the foxhole doing the March trilogy. So it's another, like, it's nice to be able to take that and take the hyper expressiveness and dreaminess of that and bring it back to nonfiction. A lot of it is just like finding spaces where you're able to push the component that is not of the genre, that you're actively making, looking for the personal qualities and the emotional containment within nonfiction work.
Yeah, very cool. Well, let's look at some of the images that will create a starting point for further conversation. And if our technology is working right, then people are seeing us and right now the cover of the book. And I want to stick with this cover for a couple of minutes. One is to have you. This gets done in a poetic way in the book, but I'd love you to talk a little bit about how you landed on this title, which has a kind of enigma to it, I think. Yeah. You bet.
Well, I think every book I've ever done, every solo book, I've changed the title along the way. By this point, I've learned this is just going to be a pattern throughout my life, and this is where I should listen to the voices I trust. I should listen to my editors. I should listen to my wife, who is always my first editor. Originally, the book was called Tornado Children, which is the title of the 6th chapter in the book. And to me, it was evocative and emotional, and it really described what was at the core of, young people growing up amidst, or really all of us being children in the eye of the tornado, amidst this very turbulent rightward shift socially and politically, and how to pick yourself up, how to equip each other to be able to get through it. But a lot of making a book is finding a balance between what you feel you need to do creatively and then actually listening to more concrete requirements of the people who are helping you make that book the best it can be or get it on shelves. So the Abrams was interested in something that was more directly linked while still being evocative and not so obvious, but looking for just another title that was, less cut loose to the wind than Tornado Children. And so I went through like 100 titles in the course of a couple of days, and I have them printed out somewhere. And then I would just walk around the house. This is like right at the beginning of the pandemic, I think. It was pretty late on when I finalized the title shift. I would just walk around crossing off this list of 100 names until I was down to 4 or 5. But importantly, before the pandemic, Save It for Later emerged as a potential title because of, a commonly used like computer command. I think originally it was Save for Later, or returning to documents. Like there was a tension between the like a literal interpretation of it, like saving our society so that we will have something to grow old into, so that our kids will actually have some remnants of a democracy to grow old in, actually saving it for later. And then the dynamic tension between that and the kind of casualness and the assumption of social progress, of inevitable social progress, which sort of has us, you know, if we're not careful, flippantly putting off necessary actions and participation for some other time because it's not convenient, or things seem like they'll just work out until they don't. So it's the dynamic tension between those two meanings that really struck me. Then the pandemic hit, and I'd say by the end of the second week, I had already kind of settled on save for later or save it for later. But in those first 2 weeks of lockdown, I remember maybe 50 times telling my kids, you know, whether it was like, yeah, glitter slime or toilet paper or paper towels or whatever, just really be like, you guys, we've got to save some for later. We got to save it for later. We don't know when we're getting more paper towels or whatever. And it became like, I don't believe in signs, but it was clearly a sign where I'm like, this is a third layer of meaning. And to me, that just means, yeah, this is going to be the title.
That's great. And not to get too wonky, but you put it on a protest sign here on the cover, and it kind of gives it that extra layer of, like, I immediately thought it's such a great contrast to the more standard protest chant of, when do we want it? Now. And it's like, well, we also have to save it for later too. So yeah, just really, really beautifully layered. The other thing, well, let's maybe get into this on the next image. But you've chosen to present your children as in these anthropomorphized ways, and it turns out to be a really affecting emotional choice in the various pieces of the book. So just wanted to hear what, you know, how you landed on that strategy. Yeah.
You bet. Early in 2018, when I decided this was going to be a book, I actually have like an early cover I did and a couple of drawings, which later morphed into the first chapter, featuring my kids as just their normal human selves. And it was like, it was fine. It was, you know, it was what I lived. So that was my go-to. And I just let it sit for a while. The two major issues that anthropomorphizing my kids helped solve was, number one, just a basic consent issue, besides my kids being small kids and not having the ability to consent. But the fact that, you know, I'm writing about my life, but my life or my experiences are largely inseparable from the experiences of my kid and of my wife. Mm-hmm. And so it was just it wasn't necessarily calculated, because I wanted, you know, I'd been drawing my kids as unicorns and ponies for a little while, just at home, like on napkins for their lunch and stuff. And so to me, it seemed obvious that it would sort of at least take some of the sting or some of the pressure off simply by removing their likeness from the pages. And it gave just enough of a buffer that I was able to kind of go with that and be more mindful with each panel about how much I was choosing to really push the presence of my kids and make sure that even though this book is about those experiences, it sort of forced me into a position where I'm being mindful with each scene. The other reason is has more to do with readership and the way, sort of like the contract between creator and reader. The fact that if one of the core concepts behind this book is that, sure, these are my family's experiences, but it's who cares about us? It's not about our experiences. This book exists because this is what a considerable majority of American families had to kind of wade through and figure out along the way. And so hopefully a reader will automatically kind of project their own kids, their own family unit, their own experiences, their own doubts onto the pages as they're reading them, which is what I want. Like, it becomes less about me, hopefully, and becomes more a conduit by which for a reader to process their experience getting through the last 5 years.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. There's, for lack of a better word, a kind of universalizing impetus there. And as I've been talking about the book with people, I sometimes bring it up in the context of Scott McCloud and understanding comics, and how it's such a great demonstration of how symbols and iconography works in the comic book lexicon. So,
and he refers to this as masking, which is having realistic representational surroundings with iconographic, cartoony characters. It's a very automatic way for a reader to identify with characters in a comic, even without thinking.
Yeah, it's yeah, exactly. It's fantastic. So in this image, your kids decide to go have a march on their own, and your contribution to the slogans is a very practical one here in the image.
Yeah, it's my job.
Exactly. But again, you know, the more I read the book, the more I really just felt so enveloped by those kind of the meta narrative of it, you know, that actually the instruction to stay safe is similar to the instruction that is in a protest slogan. You know, it's an interesting mirror to it, and you capture that kind of vibe constantly. I also wanted to ask, by the way, about your use of color. You do a lot of these kind of washes in different colors in different pages or stories, and yeah, how did you land on that for this?
Well, before the March trilogy, starting with The Silence of Our Friends and The Year of the Beast, I had really fallen in love with using a simplified gray wash as instead of trying to get excessively noodly with my cross hatching and build up gradients with lines. It really spoke to me as a cartoonist, and I feel like I really, you know, made my home with it with March. Immediately after March, I did the book Come Again. And so trying to kind of evolve from book to book, this is where I was like, okay, I love what I'm doing right now with gray washes. I'm not interested in doing a full color comic for a number of reasons. But for one, I don't think it provides that much benefit in terms of world building or the reader's experience compared to how much time and effort goes into it. So a lot of Come Again wound up being using like a duotone method where I'm doing standard gray washes like with March, but I'm adding just one color per scene. And the combination of gray with a single color gives the illusion of there being a lot more colors than just one. And it worked perfectly. A lot of that was thanks to Darwin Cook and Matt Kent and a lot of other cartoonists. But I fell in love with it so much, it didn't take any extra time beyond doing a gray wash. So with each book, I try to evolve my execution a little bit. And for this, a lot of it was recognizing I can switch colors for particular moments in time or meaning or tone. But I tried to divide up the color divisions at first by seasons. Originally, before I had incorporated all these essay components, the memoir parts were really divided up into that first winter at the beginning of the regime in early 2017, maybe the summer prior, summer 2016, the fall, the weekend right before the election of 2016. So to me, it was a simple, like, you know, this is color coded blue for winter, reddish for fall. It was a no-brainer. And I was like, I'm going to crank this book out in 6 months and get it right out. But, you know, one reason I wanted to do the book was because things are rolling so fast and changing so fast. So what's also interesting is you have to evolve your scope and your vision of the book. So a lot of the color coding process fell off the tracks then, and had to open itself up to just using color where it felt appropriate and in the way it felt appropriate, as the book wound up being the result of like 2 years of effort instead of 6 months.
Yeah. Wow, that's cool. So being untethered from the linear progression, created a different craft opportunity there.
It did, yeah. And I'd already I liked the color choices, so I wasn't going to budge on those. But I was like, all right, I'm going to stick with these. But yeah, like you kind of have to know when to undo the scaffolding of your vision. Sometimes that's the thing that holds you in.
Good wisdom. Now, this is from an essay that I think it might be the shortest one in the book, and definitely one of the more autobiographical ones. But you're at a comic convention, and you're exploring the different levels of people dressing as characters, and the disturbing side of someone dressed as a Nazi, yeah, I wondered if you, because again, it sort of speaks to those layers of like, we are responsible for the iconography we put into the world, and how it affects other people, which I think is one of the, it's a recurring theme throughout Save It for Later. So yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
You bet. Okay, so this essay is called Pecking Order. This was actually the very first story in Save It for Later that I had completed on a writing level, way back in 2013, before any of this madness.
Right.
It was based on interactions I had in 2011 at a Comic-Con, and a lot of it simply had to do with, at the time, recognizing that there was a particularly toxic, smug, kind of angry nerd boy who was, who you could consistently find them kind of building themselves up over being inflammatory, being reactionary, and like that is sort of like balanced with the idea that, like, as a comic book nerd, but as a cartoonist, cartoonists are always fighting for the legitimacy of their form as literature, as fine art, and all this stuff. Not only do people spend a little too much time trying to separate literary graphic novels from superhero comics when they are not mutually exclusive things, but this is where you can find nerds like myself trying so hard to vie for the legitimacy of their art that you can catch them being dismissive and downright punching down at other components of nerd culture. So basically, in this essay, I sneak two friends into a Comic-Con, but we're walking past all these cosplayers. There's a huge cosplay component to the show, but because I don't care about cosplaying, my natural assumption is that I got to get these friends past all this nonsense so they can get to the books. Yeah. When I'm missing all of the really good stuff from a social and community and creative level in cosplayerhood, and it takes my friends, these outsiders, to really see the relatively inclusive nature, the expressive nature, and it makes me realize that I'm just being quite a dick. And but then, like, right on the heels of that, there's the inevitable appearance of the Nazi cosplayer, and the question is sometimes is like, are you portraying a character? Does that even matter? It's important to contextualize that this is 2011, so this is sort of like seeing a gathering storm from the distance of angry, smug, reactionary white boys who have found a little way to exercise some leverage just by pissing people off.
Right.
But at the time, also being like, well, this guy's just a jerk. Like, this guy's just dumb, right? And like, while I'm hand-wringing over whether or not to confront him, someone else confronts him. You know, you see it play out just like how we've seen it play out over the past 5 to 7 years. But it's one of these things where I'm like, oh, how bad could it really get? And now we are living the consequences of answering that question.
Exactly. Yeah. It's and I really love this. Here's that moment you're referring to where you're saying, what's the worst that can happen, you know, by this dumb jerk doing this, but sort of not seeing that bigger picture. And I love that top image, because again, it sort of gets at the subtle. The use of color is fantastic, and how you kind of divide. You know, there's to see this person in a bifurcated way. You know. Anyway, really strong piece. Now, this is an image from the essay in the book that is by far the least autobiographical, and it's an incredible piece. The title alone is another title with multiple meanings, About Face, and you really dive into examining how certain symbols, beard wearing or skull imagery, the skull image of the Punisher in Marvel Comics, how those images change and can be co-opted in different contexts. What kind of research did you, you know, it's just a fascinating topic, and you explore it so in depth. What kind of research did you do for this?
Well, initially, for context, I grew up as a G.I. Joe kid in a career military family during the Reagan era. And so a lot of what About Face explores is jumping off of questions I had as an 8-year-old. A lot of it having to do with initial conversations with my dad about Geneva Convention regulations for uniforms, about amongst the different service branches in the armed forces, haircut regulations, facial hair regulations, and particularly how these differed from, you know, hair and uniforms and insignia used on my G.I. Joe action figures. And using that as a basis and as a starting point, I'd say over the past 20 years, really seeing, on one end, seeing real life military garb more closely, or dress codes or lax dress codes, sort of more closely resemble the G.I. Joe action figures, but also taking sort of a trickling down of style and aesthetic choices, whether it has to do with the removal of color from the American flag, particularly post 9/11 for fatigues, like just an olive and black American flag, trickling its way down from active duty military to private security and paramilitary forces to law enforcement, until finally a lot of these symbols, and that includes the Punisher skull blending with the flags. It includes the evolution of beards, and also the re-normalization and commodification of the Mohawk, now as a masculine military mainstream component from the mid-2000s. How all of this eventually becomes an apolitical style component in mass pop culture. It becomes cool stuff to buy. And so I break down, like all those were observations I had. A lot of it that sparked it was just driving around my town throughout 2017 and watching certain stylistic shifts occur. The biggest one for me, besides bumper sticker culture and really paying attention to Spartan iconography, Punisher iconography, etc., but paying attention to late modeled cars and trucks, and how starting by the end of 2016, those late model cars and trucks were outselling solid black over anything else. And it wasn't just that, it was the fact that detailing was becoming much more common for fully blacked out cars. And for the first time in my life, noticing that what I would consider to be very normal people. And this is me just like having an attitude about myself for being like, you know, like I'm an aging punk or whatever. I'm different from you. But noticing that like what I'm accustomed to sneering at squares about, like caring about brand names and corporate icons, now for the first time, like the Dodge icon or the Chevy icon was being blacked out as a detailing option for these cars, which was fascinating to me, that it had more to do with the lack of accountability, the lack of identification, the complete blacking out as a power flex than it did to brag that you have the Dodge logo on your truck. So that natural interest, that natural curiosity led me down, you know, a couple of holes in terms of like military journalism, style journalism, auto trade articles that sort of like uncovered surprising things about auto manufacturers building cars and trucks that were also being used by the military in the Middle East and Central Asia to be modifiable, almost like action figure vehicles, but now generating those for public consumption and military consumption, basically turning everyone's cars and trucks into action figures. It became very immersive. Like it took me about 6 months from start to finish to do the research and write and draw, but it was a buildup of decades prior to that. Lots of questions to unpack.
That is great. Well, finally, the last image, just to end on this this page in which you depict both the what is happening in the crowd and what is happening around the dinner table, you know, and there are the cats with the family, yeah, I think this speaks to that joining of the personal and the political, and finding like not only where they meet but why they both have to exist. Yeah, I don't think I have a question. I just admire that is such a strong theme in the book.
Well, thank you. And there's kind of a tightrope to be walked with some of the passages in this book, because like out of context, there's always the danger that it can be read as a very privileged but also hands washed kind of approach to engagement and activism. In fact, it's the opposite. But minus the privilege. Like I'm trying to like be very plain about my cushy white middle class privilege in a very safe town with a Nazi problem, but still a very safe town, all things considered. And basically trying to push the notion that part of normalization under authoritarianism has to do with disempowerment, has to do with losing a sense of hope and connection to other people, has to do with losing a sense of trust in strangers to be concerned about the same things as you, to show up when you can't show up, and thus the obligation for you to act in kind and for you to pick up the slack for other people when they can't do it. And that was one of the main reasons I wanted to start doing the book, was simply recognizing that these core concepts of civic engagement and of how and why mass protest works with people you've never met, filling the streets, it involves a social contract, and the social contract is exactly what authoritarianism seeks to throw out the window. But it involves, like, yeah, the courage to trust your neighbors or to trust them again. You know, there's one of the things we've really lost over this past decade, and to speak of the Minneapolis area directly, you know, is the notion of trust, not just in institutions, in law enforcement, in public safety, but the way that disinformation, fear, and paranoia can take the common trust and the assumptions of trust that are kind of contracted between neighbors and endanger those as well. And that's going to be a hard climb for us. You know, it's going to take us decades to kind of repair a lot of this damage that was done over the 2010s.
Absolutely. So well said. And a lot of work, but we need to do it. We're capable of it, and that is something that your book is so encouraging to, not only in the parental mode, with that feeling that you're the necessity of teaching young people that this is part of the world, but there's a great scene in which you're protesting and you tell a supportive passerby they could do it too. It's none of us are prohibited from it, and in fact we kind of need to do it. So
Certainly.
Thank you for this. We'll leave the images now, and partially because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we seem to be in your studio, or a place you draw.
Yes,
and
indeed.
I wonder if you might give us a little insight into any of your process, your tools, what you have at hand, what it takes for you to make these wonderful graphic novels.
You bet. Well, a lot of this is just a product of my exact age. I'm 42, and I just kind of missed the boat about basic education with working digitally for anything. So I do 99% of my work physically on paper with physical tools. Like the year I graduated from high school was the last year before my school had a computer available. And then I went to college for cartooning and graduated the year before any cartooning student was required to take any kind of computer art class. And I just never had the time to catch up. So yeah, a lot of it happens here at the table. My go-to tools are I buy just endless reams of Bristol paper. And one thing that's great about comics is the sheer accessibility of what it takes to make a comic. You only need something to draw with, something to draw on, and an idea. That makes it, in my opinion, the most democratic, with a small d, mass medium. So all I use is a mechanical pencil, and then I use India ink with a little crow quill nib. This is like a cheap plastic thing that costs 50 cents, and then the nib costs $1 a piece, and it breaks or falls apart after about 2 pages. So I just buy 100 of them, and you have to throw a third of them out anyway because they're defective. But the other 2 work great. I use a toothbrush sometimes to add texture and little splatters with the ink. This was my actual toothbrush before it was my cartooning toothbrush.
May it never be again.
I do the other half of my inking with a number 2 watercolor brush and insider tip. Yes, I keep the tip sharp with my tongue. I do all my lettering either with just cheap technical pens that cost like $2 to $3, or just like a roller pen. Like this is actually my favorite thing to use. It doesn't take anything fancy, and it doesn't even take correct tools to make comics. When it comes to the work itself, like these are from a smattering of different books, but usually I keep things like this is from my new book that's not even announced. This is like a new work of fiction. There we go. This is about how tight my pencils are. I keep them fairly loose because I like to do most of my thinking with the ink. When I was doing March or working with any other writer, I tighten them up a little bit for clarity. And in particular with March, wanting to kind of like make sure likenesses and details were ironed out. But I usually pencil a page in like half an hour or something, and I save most of my time for the inking. Then from there, I letter. Oh, here's a rejected page that I redrew from Save It for Later. So this is what it looks like at the lettering stage. You just letter right over it. And if there's a section of the page where it's going to be white lettering on black, then at this point I scan it in, and then I convert it to negative, and then I can just ink over it with black ink. So a lot of that stuff just disappears. Then once I get done inking, oh, here we go. This is that page you had on a slide earlier. Yeah, like I just go through. I think all of the inking on this is with a a brush actually. But I just move through the black, and invaluable tool, I use a hair dryer once I'm done inking, and I basically just seal in the ink with the hair dryer, because the next thing I do is I hit it with watered down India ink for gray washes. And if the ink is not completely set, then you're going to get immediate bleeding. And also, you know, it's nice to not be precious. Like, I make typos all the time. And wait, here we go. When I make typos, I just make a little note on the side. Like, I make a little star and I correct the typo, and I just fix it later. And I move on. And then from here, then I have my one color choice, that kind of ruddy red, and I layer it over the grays. And then it's just a matter of scanning, gluing on digitally the rest of the lettering, and kind of cleaning it up. You know, here's a March page, so it's a very similar process. Sure. But really the only difference is minus that extra layer of color. So this is certainly tighter in spots because it needed to be, but it operates under the same principle. And yeah, here's, I guess, for a full color situation, this one, the cover is a little bit bigger. And a lot of that's because, you know, sometimes you'll be doing pages years before the book comes out, and you don't know what the dimensions of the book will be when you're finished. Right. So for a cover, you want to add as much extra space on every side as possible, because you ultimately don't know what you're going to lose when the cover gets laid out. Yeah, a lot of it was just letting myself go wild with full color, but trying to limit a lot of other things that might make the cover too much. So turning the foreground characters into as much silhouette as possible, and then having characters in the background lose a lot of their shadow, so that it's just these outlines that I'm filling in with color and with wash.
Right. Thank you for that. An incredible tour through your process, and I'm so moved by how rooted you are in tools almost anyone could use. That is really staying true to the DIY aesthetic, and I admire that. I want to end with a question, and a very standard one, but I think in this case I feel a big sense of excitement about it. You alluded to a project that's not announced, a new fiction book. If you want to say more about that. The project that is announced is a new book that will continue the story of Congressman Lewis. And I'd love you to tell our audience what about either of these things.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, now that the cat is out of the bag, in August, the March Gang, we had been working since 2016 on the next step in John Lewis's story, being his transition from direct action to public service. And even as I was drawing March Book 3, Andrew and Congressman Lewis and I were having these discussions about all of this really fascinating, emotional stuff that was happening between 65 and 69 in John Lewis's life. And the question being, is it March Book 4? Is it something else entirely? We settled on, well, everybody loves a trilogy. So that was one component. But another part was, this really does mark a shift in young John Lewis's life that would have ramifications for the rest of his life. And so Congressman Lewis, he was a fan of starting over fresh, symbolically, and as a means to tackle it through, you know, a new approach. So it's called Run, in keeping with the spirit of March. First you march, then you run. And really it picks up 2 days after the conclusion of the March trilogy. So 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, Congressman Lewis was back on the streets in a small town in Georgia with 12 other protesters trying to attend a segregated church service. He got arrested 2 days after the Voting Rights Act, when he was at the U.S. Capitol getting that bill signed. And across town, importantly, on the same day, there was a huge open air rally of uniformed Klansmen. It was between 300 and 700 white supremacists marching through town. But significantly, Andrew spent a lot of time in the script digging into the actual, words spoken by this grand wizard or whatever of the Klan to illuminate that, just like today, the white supremacist extreme right is always paying attention to what's going on in pro-democracy, pro-human rights, anti-racist people's efforts, paying attention to people's movements and adopting and co-opting a lot of the tactics and a lot of the methods. So it's pretty disturbing. Like you have this grand wizard kind of schooling all these white supremacists using the language, the cosmetic language of nonviolent resistance. And a lot of it is we wanted to show how for decades this has been a problem of white supremacists trying to become more camera ready, more camera friendly, being able to normalize their approach and recognizing that the best way to do it was to be able to at least adopt a lot of the rhetoric and the cosmetic components of an orderly, nominally nonviolent march, and to hopefully get press for that. Anyway, we worked quietly for many years, and it was the last thing we got to work on with Congressman Lewis. But he was involved at every stage, at every step of the way, including through his treatment over this past year. And it's loaded with a lot of emotions for all of us. But we're just really happy that we did our best, and we think that it couldn't be more timely. So that'll be out in August.
That is incredible. Thank you for that, and we look forward to seeing it. Nate, I wish I could talk longer, but our time is at an end. I do want to encourage all our viewers out there to pick up this amazing book. And before I leave, I want to thank everyone for giving consideration to purchasing a book at a literary event, because when you do that, you support everyone involved, not only the authors and their publishers, but the event hosts and a great independent bookstore that is based on the ground, in a city, in a community. And I make that point now because this April 24th is Independent Bookstore Day, a national celebration that didn't happen last year, obviously. But if you're watching tonight from anywhere near the Twin Cities, Rain Taxi has announced our plans for this year's Independent Bookstore Passport, which we're creating with the support of great sponsors such as Coffee House, Grey Wolf, Milkweed, Mizna, and Free Spirit Publishing, along with many others. Please check out the information on our website and join us in the bookstores if you can. If you're farther away than the Twin Cities, there is probably an independent bookstore near you that would welcome you. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Nate, for joining us. Good night.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.